Please subscribe to BitStories channel to see more our videos. A midweek evening disturbance. It was a Wednesday, close to 10 p.m., when the insistent chime of the doorbell shattered the quiet of the evening. This seemingly innocuous interruption would be the first domino to fall, exposing the hidden life my wife, Kira, had so carefully constructed. As I opened the door, two figures stood on the porch, a man and a woman, their attire suggesting some sort of official capacity, though their clothes seemed oddly dated and worn. A premonition washed over me. This had to be connected to the plan Chase and I had set in motion. "Good evening, sir," the woman began. "Would you happen to be Mr. Jason Palmer?" Maintaining a facade of ignorance, despite my churning gut, I responded, "Yes, I'm Jason. Can I ask who you are and what brings you here so late without any prior notice?" From behind me, Kira's voice, laced with a tremor she couldn't quite mask, called out, "Who's at the door, honey?" The worry etched on her face as she joined me, wiping her hands on a dish towel, was unmistakable. "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart," I replied, forcing a calm demeanor. Her worried expression deepened. The woman's attention shifted to Kira. "And you, ma'am? Are you Mrs. Kira Palmer?" The man beside her remained silent, an air of detached indifference about him. "Look," I interjected, feigning annoyance to conceal my anticipation. "You're asking us questions on our doorstep without even identifying yourselves or explaining your purpose." With a sigh of resignation, the woman reached into her bag while her companion retrieved something from his jacket. In a synchronized movement, they flashed their badges under the porch light. "I'm Detective Sergeant Hopkins, and this is Detective Curtis," she stated. "We're investigating an assault that occurred earlier today, and we need to speak with both of you." I put on my practiced expression of astonishment, hoping it looked convincing. "An assault? Why would you think we have any involvement?" I inquired, feigning bewilderment. I glanced at Kira, whose face had paled dramatically. She looked as if she might collapse. The male detective finally spoke. "The victim sustained serious injuries this afternoon. During a brief period of lucidity before undergoing surgery, he identified Kira Palmer as a significant witness. Other witnesses have corroborated her presence at the scene." Continuing my charade of obliviousness, I asked, "Who was this victim and how could my wife possibly be connected?" I let my voice trail off, as if a bewildered husband was struggling to comprehend the situation. My performance seemed to be effective, at least for the moment. Detective Hopkins didn't hesitate. "Mrs. Palmer," she inquired directly, "what is the nature of your relationship with a Mr. Noah Myers? And why were you with him when he was attacked in the rear parking area of the Newton Motel on King Street earlier this afternoon?" The detective's bluntness left no room for evasion. Kira sobbed, on the verge of fainting. I slowly turned towards her, my expression a carefully crafted blend of shock and concern, which then subtly shifted to anger as she began to cry uncontrollably, shrinking away from me. A Friday revelation. Fridays generally offered a respite from the week's intensity, and this particular Friday was no exception. My afternoon was proceeding smoothly when my secretary, Alexis, informed me of a call on line 1. "Kennedy speaking," I answered. A gravelly voice on the other end announced, "This is Deputy Perkins from the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. I need to arrange a meeting with you, preferably this afternoon or evening." "Deputy Perkins?" I responded, suspecting Jason had fulfilled his part of the agreement. "Can you tell me the reason for this meeting?" "I'd rather discuss it in person, Mr. Kennedy," he replied evasively. "I also suggest Mrs. Kennedy be present. In fact, it's imperative she's there." I suppressed a smile of satisfaction. "I'm puzzled, but certainly intrigued," I responded. "Of course you're welcome to come over. How about 7 p.m.? My wife works during the day, but she'll be home by then." 7 p.m. works. "I'll see you then," he confirmed before disconnecting. I replaced the receiver, stood, and inhaled deeply, gazing out the window. Tonight, everything comes to fruition, I thought. But I couldn't afford to get ahead of myself. I needed to maintain my composure, execute my role flawlessly. I needed to inform Bella of the deputy's impending visit to avoid arousing her suspicion. The home phone rang repeatedly before diverting to voicemail. This was unusual. Bella typically answered at this time. Perhaps she was showering or running a quick errand. I waited, expecting her to return the missed call, but my subsequent attempts yielded the same result: voicemail. Checking my watch, I debated waiting longer, but a persistent unease gnawed at me. After another 10 minutes, I left a message, striving for a tone of puzzled concern. "Hey Bella, it's me. I'll be home around 6:15. I received a peculiar call from a Deputy Perkins. I'm clueless about the reason, but thought I should inform you of a potential visitor this evening. Just wanted to give you a heads up. See you soon." As I hung up, I couldn't resist a slight smile. The message was impeccable, calm, tinged with worry, precisely how an unsuspecting husband would react. I had perfected the tone, balancing concern with confusion, concealing the quiet triumph brewing within. Everything was proceeding as planned. Wednesday's aftermath. By the time the detectives departed, I had unleashed a torrent of pent-up fury, yelling until my voice was raw, while Kira dissolved into a heap of tears and remorse. It required immense self-control to keep my anger purely verbal, to refrain from physical violence. Detectives Hopkins and Curtis remained present, silent observers ensuring Kira's safety from anything beyond my verbal onslaught. Once my anger had subsided, I provided the detectives with my carefully fabricated account of events, a narrative of ignorance and innocence. After their inquiries were satisfied, I retreated upstairs. I had planned my departure meticulously, so packing my belongings was a swift, almost mechanical process. But the exit needed to be impactful, dramatic. I descended the stairs, suitcase in one hand, laptop and backpack in the other, my footsteps deliberately heavy. Kira remained curled on the sofa, her sobs muffled, the embodiment of regret. I felt no pity, only disdain. As I packed, the sordid details of her affair, revealed by the detectives, replayed in my mind. She had visited the Newton Motel twice, both times to meet Noah Myers, but this particular rendezvous had concluded far more tragically than she could have anticipated. As they exited the motel room, a hooded individual emerged from behind a van, ambushing Myers near his Lexus. The assailant, armed with a baseball bat, unleashed a savage attack. Myers never had a chance. The attacker's relentless blows fractured ribs, an arm, and a leg, but the most brutal injuries were inflicted upon Myers' groin. The assailant made no attempt to conceal his actions from Kira. He simply stared at her as he finished, the bat resting on his shoulder, shaking his head before vanishing into the adjacent convenience store parking lot. Myers' battered body was discovered, and Kira remained frozen in terror. Only after the attacker fled did onlookers notice the injured man. Some rushed to assist, while others recorded the scene with their phones. Eventually, Kira's presence was noticed, and several phones captured her image, linking her to Myers. Witnesses recounted her frantic attempts to unlock her car, her desperation palpable. Finally, she reached Myers. Detective Hopkins and Curtis relayed the remaining details. Myers, barely conscious, mumbled two names, Kira and Bella, before surgery. His statement, implicating Kira, was sufficient to trigger this catastrophic chain of events. "Mrs. Palmer," Detective Hopkins had inquired impassively, "can you explain what transpired between you and Mr. Myers?" Kira, utterly defeated, whispered, "Jason, I'm so sorry, Her voice cracked, and she turned away, tears flowing. I had heard enough. My outburst of rage and demands for answers finally elicited the truth. They had met for a sexual encounter. Her pathetic attempt to justify it with, "It's not what you think," almost made me laugh. It was then that I ascended the stairs, packing theatrically, slamming drawers for emphasis. Everything was unfolding precisely as planned. I replayed these events as I drove away from the house we had shared. 1 year of cohabitation, 3 years of supposed matrimony. Within 30 minutes of the detective's arrival, I was en route to a pre-booked hotel. I needed space, not just to distance myself from Kira, but to maintain the facade. More crucially, I needed to prepare for the next phase of the plan with Chase. The end game was approaching, Friday's confirmation. Arriving home after the call with Deputy Perkins, I found no surprises. Bella was absent, her car gone. Everything seemed to be aligning perfectly. I dropped my gym bag and retrieved a beer from the refrigerator. The blinking light on the answering machine indicated my earlier message remained unchecked, or perhaps deliberately ignored. I took a sip of beer and surveyed the house, everything seemingly in order. Yet a subtle dissonance hung in the air, an unusual silence, a sense of something amiss. I went upstairs to change, and as I undressed, I noticed Bella's clothes were gone. A sigh escaped my lips. I checked her dresser. The drawers were empty. Her belongings vanished. A blank slate remained. Although I had anticipated this, the reality of it evoked a simmering anger. This was it. The game was afoot. Downstairs, after changing, I finally realized what had felt off earlier. Several of Bella's decorative items, photographs, and personal effects were missing. Good riddance, I thought. I should have felt some sadness. We had spent a significant portion of our lives together. But at that moment, anger overshadowed all other emotions. I had a role to maintain when Deputy Perkins arrived. Upon his arrival, the first question came swiftly. "Mr. Kennedy," Deputy Perkins inquired, "when did you become aware of your wife's affair with Mr. Evan Brewer?" I donned my practiced expression of bewildered astonishment. "My wife's what? Affair? Brewer?" I echoed, feigning genuine shock. "You're saying she's been unfaithful? With whom?" I inhaled deeply, closing my eyes momentarily as if composing myself, while inwardly I reveled in the flawless execution of my performance. Opening my eyes, I rubbed them with Tabasco-laced fingers, inducing tears that enhanced the effect. "So her lover is this Brewer," I whispered, sinking heavily onto the sofa. The deputy nodded subtly. "No, I had no clue." "May I speak with Mrs. Kennedy, sir?" Deputy Perkins inquired. "Perhaps she can clarify certain aspects of our investigation. Is she present? We'll require her statement as well." I shook my head, feigning confusion. She's gone. When I arrived home, her belongings were missing. I can only assume she's left me." This was my cue to transition from heartbroken husband to wronged, indignant spouse. Since when does the sheriff's office investigate marital infidelity while hard-working, trusting husbands are diligently providing for their families? I rose, pacing, gesturing emphatically, occasionally glaring at the impassive deputy. He seemed more bored than intimidated. "Mr. Kennedy," Deputy Perkins responded calmly, "we don't investigate infidelity. We investigate when such affairs result in aggravated assault, battery, or even attempted murder." He observed me intently as he spoke, his voice calm but probing. I put on my most shocked expression, silently channeling a line from Casablanca. A chilling realization washed over me. My wife's infidelity was a cruel twist I never anticipated. Feigning ignorance, I played along, nodding like a puppet in this twisted drama. "Officer," I stammered, feigning shock. I'm utterly bewildered by the news of my wife's affair. But to suggest she attempted murder? Surely you can't be serious. Officer Perkins's lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "No, Mr. Kennedy. We don't believe she's responsible for the assault itself. Our investigation focuses on identifying other individuals with a potential motive, such as, hypothetically, a husband consumed by rage." Showtime. It was my turn to deliver a performance worthy of an Academy Award. "Officer," I began, my voice laced with sincerity. I was completely unaware of my wife's infidelity. Violence is not in my nature. Pray tell, when precisely did this alleged assault occur? He scrutinized me, gauging how much information to reveal. "Last night, around 8:30 p.m., in the parking lot of the Lone Tree Road Motel. It shares premises with a bar where Evan Brewer, the victim, was a regular. Witnesses confirm he frequently met your wife there. Last night, they shared 2 drinks, both displaying signs of agitation, according to the bartender. Your wife departed first, followed shortly by Mr. Brewer, who seemed to be in a rush as he headed towards his vehicle." Perkins paused, observing my every twitch and micro-expression. A witness in the parking lot observed a masked figure, clad in black, ambush Mr. Brewer from behind, striking him with what appeared to be a baseball bat. Even after Mr. Brewer fell, the attacker continued the brutal assault, focusing on his torso and specifically his groin. Perkins stopped again, searching for any flicker of guilt, surprise, or anger. I winced subtly at the detail of the attack's focus, but quickly regained my composure. My face, carefully crafted, projected a mask of innocence and shock. The officer pressed on. "In our experience, Mr. Kennedy, assaults of this nature, particularly those targeting the groin, often suggest a vengeful husband retaliating against his wife's lover." I released a controlled sigh and leaned back, feigning contemplation. "Officer," I said, my voice strained, "I'm struggling to process all of this. My wife's betrayal, this violent incident, it's overwhelming." Perkins nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I assure you, officer," I continued, "I had no involvement in this attack. My only connection is through my wife's relationship with Mr. Brewer. Last night I was at the office with my manager, Alexis Jenkins, working on our business tax returns until almost 10 p.m. She can corroborate my alibi." Perkins's expression remained neutral. "Yes, Mr. Kennedy, I spoke with Miss Jenkins after your departure from the office earlier. She did confirm your account. Now a touch of indignation was required." "You've already questioned her? Then why subject me to this interrogation, implying my involvement?" "Mr. Kennedy," Perkins said, stepping back slightly, his demeanor shifting to one of cautious distance. "We must thoroughly investigate all possibilities. In these situations, the wronged husband is typically the prime suspect until proven otherwise." "And I presume you've now proven otherwise?" I challenged, maintaining a controlled yet frustrated tone. Perkins offered a nonchalant shrug. "Let's just say we're pursuing other avenues of inquiry," he replied, his ambiguity deliberate, a clear attempt to elicit a reaction. It was time to play the offended party. "If you have any further suspicions," I stated firmly, meeting his gaze, "I advise you to contact my legal counsel." Perkins raised his hands placatingly. "Relax, Mr. Kennedy. I doubt that will be necessary. However, should Mrs. Kennedy contact you, please inform her that the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office wishes to speak with her. And of course, notify me as well if she reaches out." He presented his card. "That concludes our conversation for this evening." Perkins continued. "I offer my sincere condolences regarding the situation with your wife and the manner in which you learned of it." His words sounded rote, almost insincere. With a tip of his hat, he turned towards the door. As I reached to close it, he paused. "Remember, Mr. Kennedy, if you hear from her, we're very keen to speak with Mrs. Kennedy." I nodded silently, closing the door as he finally departed. Releasing a slow breath, a wave of relief washed over me. Jason had delivered, just as I had for him. Pouring myself a generous measure of whiskey, I raised my glass to the empty room. "Goodbye, Bella." Next Wednesday, Chase. The Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition seemed out of place in a divorce lawyer's office, but I was a man with simple pleasures. I flipped through the pages, my mind elsewhere, waiting for my appointment with Logan Armstrong, Cherokee County's most formidable divorce attorney. Her reputation for fiercely protecting her clients, particularly wronged husbands, was legendary. She was known to harbor a particular animosity towards unfaithful wives, her name alone inspiring trepidation in lawyers, judges, and even law enforcement. A week had passed since the debacle of Bella's affair and her subsequent disappearance. It was time to move forward. I had promptly contacted Logan's office, securing today's appointment. Following our call, her office had emailed a detailed checklist of steps to safeguard my assets and protect my interests. The dissolution of a marriage is never pretty. Untangling intertwined finances is a brutal process. Severing joint accounts, terminating shared credit cards, splitting assets, updating beneficiary designations, I'd meticulously addressed each item. Almost. One final strategic interaction with Jason remained on my agenda. Checking my watch, I realized I'd arrived at the lawyer's office a full 30 minutes ahead of my scheduled consultation. This was intentional. Jason and I had a carefully choreographed performance to execute. I flipped through a magazine, feigning absorption, while listening for the telltale sounds of our co-star's arrival. The door opened, footsteps approached the reception desk, and a familiar voice inquired, "Excuse me, I think I need a good divorce attorney." I resisted the powerful urge to turn, keeping my gaze fixed on the magazine, pretending to be oblivious to his presence. "Certainly, sir," the receptionist responded with practiced professionalism. "How did you hear about Miss Armstrong?" She launched into her standard intake questions, gathering client information while simultaneously assessing the effectiveness of their marketing strategies. Several minutes later, she concluded, "Please complete these forms, and we'll schedule a consultation with Miss Armstrong as soon as possible. She's fully booked today and tomorrow, but we'll aim for Friday." Jason's voice held a note of disappointment. "Oh, okay," he mumbled. Is there a restroom I could use?" "Of course." The receptionist directed him to the facilities down the hall. This was my cue. I paused for a brief interval before closing my magazine and rising. "I'll just use the restroom before my meeting," I informed the receptionist with a polite smile. She nodded, and I headed down the hallway. Inside the men's room, I located Jason washing his hands. I quickly verified that the single stall was unoccupied. As he dried his hands, I turned to face him. "Everything all right?" I asked softly. A strained smile touched his lips. "Yeah, I'm fine," he murmured. "It's just, I never realized I had that much rage bottled up. Last week, the way I acted, I've never been like that before." He averted his gaze, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Meeting my eyes again, he added, "It's frightening, truly frightening." I nodded sympathetically. "I understand." I needed to keep him focused. This gives us a plausible explanation for knowing each other. Meeting at a divorce lawyer's office? Perfectly logical. Can you maintain composure when we go back out there? He exhaled deeply, steadying himself. Yeah, I can do it. I offered a reassuring smile. Remember, your situation is different from mine. When you reach the 3rd page of the questionnaire, the one about counseling and reconciliation, you know what to mark. 6 months later, I found myself in an unfamiliar setting, a bar. I typically avoid such places, but tonight was a special occasion. It marked the 6-month anniversary of the clandestine operation Chase and I had undertaken, a scheme that allowed us both to reclaim a sense of control. Chase had initially approached me unexpectedly, completely blindsiding me. At the time, I was utterly unaware of the cracks forming in the foundation of my seemingly perfect life. Stable job, loving wife. I had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. Chase requested a meeting after work, claiming he possessed information I needed to hear. Skeptical, I agreed only after he offered to cover dinner and drinks. That evening shattered my world. He repeated incessantly, "He drugged her, Jason. He drugged her. You have to remember that. She didn't intentionally betray you." Chase presented a mountain of evidence: private investigator reports, surveillance footage, photographs, transcripts. The investigation had initially focused on his wife, Bella, but it inadvertently exposed my wife, Kira's, involvement as well. I hadn't known Kira and Bella were friends, but apparently their workplace camaraderie had blossomed into a close friendship. Lunches evolved into after-work cocktails, and Kira's excuses for staying out late to de-stress concealed her evenings with Bella. According to the reports, Kira was initially surprised by Bella's confession of infidelity, but her reaction was more fascination than disgust. An avid reader of romance novels, Kira found herself captivated by Bella's real-life drama. Kira, of course, would never cheat, or so I believed, but she relished hearing about Bella's escapades, vowing to keep her secrets. The turning point came when Bella invited 2 men to join them. Kira initially resisted, but Bella insisted. Kira left early, uncomfortable with the situation, but Bella took the men back to a motel room. One of those men, Noah Myers, drugged Kira's drink at a subsequent encounter. Disoriented and confused, she was led to a nearby motel room by Myers and his companion, Evan Brewer, under the guise of allowing her to rest. Chase hammered the point home. He drugged her. I believed him, but what truly gnawed at me was Kira's subsequent behavior. She returned for a second encounter with Myers, allowed herself to be blackmailed, and worst of all, failed to confide in me. She allowed the situation to fester, spiraling further into a web of deceit. I drained my glass, the anger still simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just the infidelity, I confided in Chase. It was the lack of trust. She didn't feel she could come to me for help. I'm her husband. It's my duty to protect her. What kind of husband am I if my own wife doesn't trust me to take care of her? We sat in silence, contemplating our drinks. Are you and Kira still working on things? Chase inquired, swirling his whiskey. Yes, I replied, taking another sip of beer. I'm still furious, but it's getting better. She's in trauma therapy, and we've been attending couples counseling for about 10 weeks now. Chase nodded. Bella was deeply involved with those guys. She probably orchestrated the whole thing, including drugging Kira. I know, I sighed. We've discussed it extensively. After a pause, I asked, have you heard from Bella? Chase shook his head. Not a word. She vanished. I suspect she'll resurface when the money runs out. My lawyer has the divorce paperwork ready. I can adjust the grounds from adultery to abandonment or irreconcilable differences, depending on how long she stays gone. Either way, I'm fine. Beneath Chase's anger, I detected lingering feelings for Bella. Counseling had taught me to recognize that intensity of emotion as a sign of unresolved affection. I raised my glass. Here's to 6 months of reclaiming our lives. Chase clinked his glass against mine. To whatever the future holds. I grinned. At least you filed for legal separation. You're free to reduce your wife count without facing a countersuit for infidelity. Chase returned the grin. You're right about that. He paused, then turned to me with a curious look. So, are you and Kira back to, being intimate? I simply nodded, unwilling to divulge the details of our post-trauma intimacy. It had taken time and therapy, but Kira was now overly eager to please, making up for her perceived transgressions. It turned out Myers had been the first to conquer that particular territory, so to speak. But I was certainly making the most of the situation now, careful not to push too hard. A throat clearing behind us drew our attention. A woman in a revealing green dress stood there, radiating confidence. Chase and I both stared, momentarily captivated. So, she said with a smirk, you two know each other, I see. Recognition dawned. Sergeant Hopkins, I exclaimed, trying to maintain composure. I wouldn't have expected a police officer to look quite so striking off duty. It's Lieutenant Hopkins now, she corrected. But that's just my professional title. When I'm out with my husband, I'm simply Mrs. Perkins. A well-built man in a tailored suit joined her. I didn't recognize him, but I noticed Chase tense beside me. Hello, Mr. Kennedy, the man said, his eyes narrowing slightly. I see my wife has introduced herself. He turned to me, extending his hand. Todd Perkins. His handshake was firm. Chase cleared his throat. Jason, this is Deputy Sheriff Perkins, the one I told you about. He investigated the case involving my soon-to-be ex-wife. I raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. And I handled the investigation for Woodstock PD concerning Mr. Palmer and his wife. I felt a surge of anxiety, but jumped in to provide a plausible explanation. Jason and I met at our respective divorce lawyers' offices. When we discovered our wives knew each other and were involved with the same men in those incidents, we stayed in touch. Now we occasionally meet to commiserate. Lieutenant Hopkins's smile faded slightly. Mr. Palmer, I'm glad you and your wife are attempting to reconcile. Incidentally, we still have an open case regarding the assault on Mr. Myers. She paused, seemingly waiting for a response. I grimaced and took a long drink, prompting her to continue. He's still in rehabilitation for his leg. He'll likely have a permanent limp, although his arm is healing well. Fortunately for him, he's right-handed. I feigned indifference. His wife, Bella, divorced him, taking their 2 children and a significant portion of his assets. Apparently, his reproductive capabilities, while still technically functional, are compromised. Low sperm motility means he's unlikely to father any more children. There was a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Even law enforcement officers, it seemed, enjoyed a touch of karmic justice. And Chase, Deputy Perkins added, if you hear from your ex-wife, inform her we're still investigating the assault on Mr. Brewer. His injuries weren't as severe as Myers, but he has substantial medical expenses. His wife, Riley, also filed for divorce. Chase grunted. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. The Perkins exchanged amused glances, but remained silent. Well, gentlemen, have a good evening, Deputy Perkins said finally, leading his wife towards the exit. Chase and I turned back to the bar, the silence heavy between us. After a few minutes, Chase leaned in and whispered, "You did get rid of the bat, right?" Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if the story was interesting.